The night fell heavy as Megan carried the mirror into her dimly lit living room, her hands trembling with both curiosity and dread. She whispered, "Grandmother wanted me to keep this close. But why does it feel so wrong?" The narrator observed how her voice cracked, echoing against the silent walls. A sudden cold wind brushed against her skin, though no windows were open. Megan said, "It almost feels alive." Her reflection blinked once before she did, and her heart lurched. The narrator described her breath catching as the glass shivered in its wooden frame. The silence was broken by a sharp creak from the floorboards, though she stood still. Megan whispered, "Did you see that?" as if the walls themselves could answer. The narrator noted that her chest tightened, her fear rising like storm clouds on the horizon. A whisper slithered through the air, too faint to understand yet chilling in tone. Megan said, "No, this isn't real," but her voice was fragile, full of terror. The narrator described how her trembling hands pressed against the ornate edges of the mirror, and her reflection tilted its head in defiance of her movement. Megan dragged the mirror into her bedroom, setting it against the wall with care yet unease. The narrator described her hands clenching the frame as if afraid to let go. She muttered, "You'll stay here, just furniture, nothing more." Yet her tone betrayed doubt. The narrator observed the silence, thick and oppressive, wrapping the room like a shroud. Megan paced slowly, her bare feet pressing into the worn rug. The lamp flickered again, and she froze, staring at the mirror. She whispered, "Stop doing that," though nothing moved. The narrator described the stillness of the reflection. Too still, unnerving. Megan pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her skin crawling as if unseen fingers brushed her neck. The narrator described Megan lying in bed, staring at the mirror's looming frame. Her breath came slow, uneven, as she pulled covers up. A faint whisper seeped into the silence, curling like smoke. Megan said, "Who's there?" Her words quivered. The whisper grew faintly louder, syllables lost but tone full of menace. Megan sat upright, clutching the blanket. The narrator observed her pulse, racing as she leaned closer. She whispered, "Grandmother, is that you?" Her eyes reflected fear mixed with desperate hope. The whisper ceased suddenly, leaving silence louder than sound. The narrator described her body trembling as she dared not breathe. The narrator described Megan sitting at her desk, the mirror just behind her. She flipped through her grandmother's journal, hoping for clues. Suddenly, her reflection appeared not behind but beside her in the glass. Megan gasped, "No, that can't be." Her hands froze over the pages. The reflection smirked faintly, its lips curling though hers did not move. The narrator described Megan's body stiffening, her heartbeat pounding against her ribs. She turned quickly, yet only her room greeted her. She whispered, "I'm losing my mind," though dread told her otherwise. The narrator described Megan meeting her friend Daniel at a cafe the next morning, exhaustion etched across her pale face. Daniel said, "You look awful, Megan. Are you sleeping at all?" She shook her head, whispering, "It's the mirror, Daniel. It's not right." Daniel laughed softly, sipping his coffee. He said, "Mirrors don't haunt people, Meg. It's stress, nothing else." Megan clenched her fists. She whispered, "You don't understand. It moved. It looked at me differently." Daniel frowned, setting down his cup. The narrator described tension stiffening his face, though his words stayed calm. He said, "It's in your head." Megan looked away, fear hollowing her eyes. The narrator described Megan standing in front of the mirror again, morning light flooding her room, but failing to warm her. She brushed her hair slowly, her eyes fixed on the glass. Megan said, "Why don't you follow me?" Her voice cracked, trembling in the quiet. The reflection moved a heartbeat too late, dragging behind as though resisting. Megan's pulse raced, her chest tightening at the unnatural pause. The narrator observed her hand shaking as she reached out to touch the frame. Her reflection's hand rose slower, deliberate, a cold mockery of her own motion. Megan whispered, "You're not me." The silence was unbearable, pressing in like a suffocating blanket. The narrator described how her reflection finally smiled faintly, though her lips never moved. Megan stumbled back, clutching her chest as her breath quickened. She turned her head away, but when her eyes flicked back, the reflection hadn't looked away. The narrator described Megan's bedroom at dusk, the light fading as shadows stretched across the walls. Megan stood frozen, staring at the mirror. A dark shape moved behind her reflection, though the room itself was empty. Megan said, "Who's there?" Her words were hushed, panicked. The shadow loomed larger, stretching like smoke. The narrator observed Megan's knees trembling as she stepped backward toward the door. The shadow lingered, not obeying the light of the lamp that flickered faintly. Megan whispered, "Daniel was wrong, this is real." The figure behind the glass leaned closer to her reflection, faceless yet heavy with menace. The narrator described Megan's throat tightening as her hand reached for the doorknob, but froze in terror. The narrator described Megan waking in the middle of the night, shivering under her blanket, though the heater hummed softly. She whispered, "It's so cold," her breath visible in the air. The air felt thick, heavy with unseen presence. She turned toward the mirror, and the glass fogged over from within. The narrator observed her leaning forward cautiously, eyes wide. She whispered, "Stop it, please." The fog swirled, forming faint outlines of hands pressing from the inside. Megan covered her mouth to stifle a scream. Her heart pounded like a drum, echoing in the silence. The narrator described her curling into herself, clutching the blanket tighter while tears welled in her eyes. The narrator described Megan sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, the mirror trembling in its wooden frame. The rattling echoed through the room though no wind stirred. Megan cried out, "Stop, just stop." Her voice cracked with desperation. The glass shook violently, dust falling from the frame. The narrator observed her pressing her palms to her ears, tears running down her cheeks. The mirror quaked harder, the reflection flickering unnaturally. Megan screamed, "Leave me alone." Her words drowned in the thunderous sound. The narrator described the floor vibrating beneath her as she pulled her knees to her chest. Finally, the noise ceased, leaving silence so deep it rang in her ears. The narrator described Megan waking from a restless sleep, her body drenched in sweat. She gasped. It felt so real, her voice hoarse. In the dream, she had been dragged toward the mirror, hands clawing at her wrists. She sat upright, trembling, eyes darting to the glass. The narrator observed her frozen in dread as the reflection lay still, yet its eyes seemed too alive. Megan whispered, "You want me there, don't you?" Her lips trembled, her voice almost breaking. The silence pressed against her like a suffocating weight. She clutched the edge of her blanket tightly, her knuckles pale. The narrator described how Megan closed her eyes, praying it was only a dream, though deep down she knew the nightmare was only beginning. The narrator described Megan sitting across from Daniel at the same cafe, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming mug. Daniel said, "You've got to stop letting that mirror get to you." Megan shook her head slowly, whispering, "It doesn't copy me anymore, Daniel. It lags behind." Her voice trembled as her eyes darted to the window as though fearing something beyond it. Daniel leaned forward and sighed. "You're exhausted, that's all." The narrator described his expression softening with worry, though his words carried denial. Megan clenched her jaw and whispered, "You're not listening." It smiled when I didn't. Daniel frowned, his fingers tapping on the table as silence stretched between them. The narrator described Megan returning home that evening, exhaustion etched into her pale face. She placed her coat on the chair and walked into her bedroom. The mirror reflected the room, but the small lamp on her bedside table was missing in the reflection. Megan froze, whispering, "That's not possible." She turned to glance at the lamp, touching its surface to confirm it was real. The narrator observed her chest tightening as she turned back to the mirror, her reflection showing a bare table. Megan said, "Why are you doing this to me?" Her voice cracked as the silence pressed heavier. The narrator described how she backed away, her breathing ragged as though the air had turned poisonous. The narrator described Megan, standing before the mirror late at night, sweat glistening on her forehead. She whispered, "You're not me," her voice trembling. Suddenly, a faint echo answered, her own voice repeating the same words from the glass. Megan staggered back, whispering, "No, no, stop." The echo grew louder, repeating her words in distorted cadence. The narrator observed her palms pressed against her ears as her knees buckled beneath her. She fell to the floor, shaking. Megan cried out, "Please, stop it!" The echo ceased suddenly, leaving a silence deeper than before. The narrator described her sobbing quietly, her tears glinting in the dim light. The narrator described Megan walking into a quiet library where Emily sat waiting. Emily was known for her cryptic knowledge of old objects. Megan said, "You know about cursed things, don't you?" Emily raised her eyes slowly from a book and whispered, "Your mirror carries weight, doesn't it?" The narrator described Megan's throat tightening as she nodded, trembling. Emily said, "It doesn't show truth, it shows what it wants." Megan whispered, "What does it want from me?" Emily closed the book and murmured, "That answer will cost you more than you think." The narrator observed Megan's skin prickle as silence thickened between them. The narrator described Megan sitting once again in her bedroom, staring at the mirror as the face inside grew clearer. The faint outline hardened into the image of a woman, her eyes sunken yet piercing. Megan whispered, "Who are you?" Her lips trembled as the reflection's mouth curled into a faint grin. The narrator observed Megan's breath shudder as her hand reached out unwillingly. The reflection pressed its hand against the other side of the glass. Megan whispered, "You want me gone." Her knees weakened as she stumbled back. The narrator described how the reflection's grin widened, the weight of dread sinking deeper into Megan's chest as her stomach turned. The narrator described Megan sitting in her grandmother Laura's old study, dust rising from shelves of books. She flipped through a brittle diary, her hands trembling. Megan whispered, "Tell me what you hid, Grandmother Laura." Her voice cracked in the silence. The faded pages revealed entries about the mirror, speaking of whispers and faces within. The narrator described Megan's throat tightening as she read the words, "The mirror feeds on the one who gazes too long." Megan's tears dotted the fragile paper as her lips quivered. She muttered, "You knew it was cursed." The diary ended abruptly, pages torn out. The narrator described Megan clutching the book to her chest as shadows stretched along the walls, making the room feel smaller. The narrator described Megan sitting before the mirror, her voice barely above a whisper. She said, "Who are you?" The reflection shifted, its features sharpening until it revealed a gaunt woman's face with hollow eyes. The reflection spoke in a voice that seemed to echo inside Megan's head, "I am what your bloodline created." Megan's lips trembled as she whispered, "You're real." The narrator described her knees weakening as she stumbled backward. The reflection pressed its hand against the glass, eyes unblinking, mouth curving into a faint grin. Megan gasped, "What do you want?" The voice hissed, "To live again." The narrator described Megan sitting on her bed, the diary open beside her. She read aloud the torn lines, "The curse binds through family blood." Her breath quickened as the truth sank in. Megan whispered, "It's tied to me." She clutched the edges of the bed tightly as the mirror's surface rippled faintly. The reflection leaned closer, mouthing words she could not hear. Megan whispered, "Grandmother Laura knew. She left it for me." The narrator described her heart racing, sweat streaking her temples. The reflection mouthed louder, her lips curling into the word Megan finally understood. "Exchange." Megan gasped, "You want my life?" The narrator described Megan staring into the mirror as the reflection began to mimic her every move, but slightly ahead of her. Megan raised her hand slowly, and the reflection's hand lifted before hers. She gasped, "You're leading me." The narrator observed Megan's chest heaving as the reflection tilted its head, its movements impatient, almost commanding. Megan stepped closer despite her trembling legs. She whispered, "No, you can't have me." The The reflection grinned wide, its teeth too sharp, its eyes unblinking. The narrator described Megan's panic rising as her breath came shallow, and her feet froze, unable to pull away. The narrator described Megan confronting Emily in the library once more, desperation in her eyes. Megan said, "It wants me. It's tied to my family, isn't it?" Emily's expression darkened as she closed the book in her lap. Emily whispered, "Blood calls to blood, Megan. It has always been so." Megan clenched her fists, her voice trembling. "You knew all along." The narrator described Emily's calm but cryptic gaze as she said, "You were never meant to escape it." Megan's heart sank as the silence swallowed the space between them. The narrator described her feeling the weight of inevitability press upon her chest as she realized there was no turning back. The narrator described Daniel entering Megan's home reluctantly, his tone skeptical but his expression uneasy. Daniel said, "You've been scaring yourself, Megan." Megan's face was pale, her eyes fixed on the mirror. She whispered, "Stay close, Daniel. It wants me." The mirror shimmered faintly, and Daniel's reflection distorted before him. Daniel muttered, "What the hell?" The narrator described his voice dropping low as his face stiffened. Suddenly, the reflection lunged forward, though Daniel had not moved. He cried out, "It touched me!" His hand clutched his arm where a dark bruise spread quickly. Megan screamed, "Do you believe me now?" The narrator described Daniel stumbling backward, horror twisting across his face as the room grew colder. The narrator described Megan's house consumed by chaos as lights flickered and walls groaned. Megan shouted, "It won't stop, Daniel." Her voice cracked in panic. Daniel grabbed her shoulders, his eyes frantic. "We have to leave now." The mirror rattled violently, the reflection hammering against the glass. The narrator described Megan's body trembling as she clung to Daniel, tears streaking her face. Shadows danced across the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes. Megan gasped, "It's everywhere." The sound of glass creaked as if it might shatter at any moment. The narrator described the suffocating air pressing around them, as though the house itself resisted their escape. The narrator described Megan standing before the mirror, sweat dripping from her brow. Her reflection moved independently, tilting its head while she stood still. Megan whispered, "Stop copying me." The reflection smirked, lifting a hand and pressing it against the glass. The narrator described Megan's breath quickening as her own hand lifted unwillingly, dragged upward by unseen force. Her voice cracked as she cried, "No, you can't control me." The reflection's eyes gleamed with triumph as its grin widened. The narrator described Megan's body trembling violently as her reflection leaned closer, pressing harder against the glass as though ready to break through. The narrator described Megan collapsing to her knees as the ghostly figure of Sarah appeared faintly behind the mirror. Sarah's pale face was sorrowful, her lips trembling as if begging for release. Megan whispered, "You're trapped in there, aren't you?" The ghost nodded faintly, her expression broken. The narrator described Megan's chest tightening as she reached toward the mirror, tears streaking her cheeks. Sarah's mouth formed the word help, though no sound emerged. Megan cried, "Tell me what to do." The reflection of the gaunt woman behind Sarah pushed forward, drowning her out. The narrator described the ghost fading into the background as the oppressive figure took her place. The narrator described Megan standing alone, realization dawning like a storm. She whispered, "It wants to trade places with me." Her hands shook violently as the reflection's grin widened, pressing against the glass. The narrator observed her stomach twist as she staggered back, fear clawing her from within. Megan cried, "You'll never have me." Her voice cracked in desperation. The reflection pounded against the glass, its teeth bared in a sinister smile. The narrator described Megan's body trembling as her tears fell freely, her knees buckling as the weight of dread bore down on her. The reflection's whisper slithered faintly soon. The narrator described Megan standing in her bedroom with the mirror looming tall against the wall. Her eyes were red from sleepless nights, but determination burned beneath her fear. Megan whispered, "If you want me, then face me." The room trembled slightly, as though acknowledging her challenge. The narrator observed her clutching a small silver crucifix she had found among Grandmother Laura's belongings. She pressed it to her chest, muttering a shaky prayer. Megan said, "You won't win." The reflection stared back, lips curling into a grin that never reached its eyes. The narrator described how the glass shimmered faintly, the reflection pressing forward as if the barrier was growing weaker. The narrator described Megan's voice breaking as she called out into the dark room. Megan cried, "Show yourself fully." The mirror rippled, and the gaunt woman stepped closer, her hollow eyes glowing faintly. The narrator described the oppressive air thickening as Megan stumbled back, gripping the crucifix tightly. The voice echoed from the glass, "Your family owes me." Megan shouted, "You can't take me." Her trembling body betrayed her fear, but she forced her legs forward. The narrator observed the reflection's hand pressing against the glass with such force that cracks spread across the surface. Megan's breath hitched as she realized the barrier was breaking. The narrator described Megan collapsing to her knees as her reflection suddenly moved freely, walking across the inside of the mirror like a separate being. Megan gasped, "You're not me." Her words echoed in desperation. The reflection tilted its head, grinning wider, whispering, "I am what you fear." The narrator observed Megan's tears falling as she slammed the crucifix against the glass. A bright flash sparked, rattling the room violently. Megan cried out, "Leave me alone." The reflection hissed, recoiling but pressing back with greater force. The narrator described Megan screaming as shadows spread across the walls, stretching long and suffocating, wrapping her in cold. The narrator described Megan's heart pounding as the mirror's glass rippled violently, the reflection pulling itself closer to breaking through. Megan whispered, "It's in my blood." Her voice quivered but carried defiance. The narrator observed her clenching her fists, nails digging into her palms. A chilling laugh filled the room, echoing from the reflection. Megan cried, "You won't have me." She pushed forward against the glass, forcing her palm flat against it. The narrator described how the reflection's face distorted in rage, its features twisting into something monstrous. The room shook, books falling from shelves, the air filled with unbearable pressure. The narrator described Megan collapsing forward as her strength waned, the reflection nearly breaking free. Megan screamed, "No!" Her voice cracked with desperation as the crucifix burned hot in her palm. She pressed it hard against the glass once more, light bursting outward. The narrator observed the reflection shrieking, its face contorting as cracks split across the mirror like veins of lightning. Megan cried, "You'll never have me." The room filled with a violent shatter of sound as the reflection recoiled violently. The narrator described her trembling body falling backward to the floor, gasping for air, the mirror still intact, but scarred with deep cracks. The narrator described Megan lying on the floor, her body trembling and her breath shallow. The crucifix slipped from her hand, clattering softly against the wood. Megan whispered, "It's over," her voice fragile and uncertain. The narrator observed her crawling slowly toward the bed, her movements heavy with exhaustion. She pulled herself up, collapsing onto the mattress as moonlight washed over her pale face. Megan whispered again, "I survived." Yet her eyes lingered on the cracked mirror, unease spreading through her chest. The narrator described how silence pressed against her ears, so complete it felt unnatural. Her heart thudded as she stared at the scarred glass, unsure if the battle had truly ended. The narrator described Megan sitting upright the next morning, her hair tangled and her eyes heavy. She stared at the mirror which appeared dormant, its cracked surface dull. Megan whispered, "You're broken now." Her voice carried a faint hope, though doubt shadowed her face. The narrator observed her standing slowly, her bare feet brushing against the wooden floor as she approached. She lifted her hand, hovering just inches from the glass. Megan whispered, "Stay silent." The narrator described her hand trembling as she pulled back, refusing to touch. For the first time in days, The mirror reflected nothing more than her weary face. Relief flickered faintly, but unease lingered in her chest. The narrator described Megan returning to the library to find Emily waiting with the same calm expression. Megan said, "It's cracked. It can't hurt me anymore." Emily's eyes lingered on her with quiet unease. Emily whispered, "Mirrors never die, Megan. They only rest." The narrator observed Megan's chest tightening as the words sank deep into her heart. Megan whispered, "So it's not finished?" Emily closed her book softly and replied, "It never was meant to be finished." The narrator described Megan's body trembling as she turned away, her steps unsteady. The weight of inevitability pressed upon her shoulders like a curse she could not shake. The narrator described Megan sitting alone in her room that evening, her eyes sunken with fatigue. She pulled the blanket tight around her shoulders, staring at the cracked mirror across the room. Megan whispered, "I'm free," though her lips trembled with doubt. The narrator observed her trying to look away, but her gaze returned to the glass again and again. For a moment, the reflection matched her perfectly, every movement aligned. Then it smiled faintly, though her own lips remained still. Megan gasped softly, her heart plummeting. The narrator described her body freezing, her breath caught in her throat as dread returned heavier than ever. The narrator described Megan sitting motionless as the room grew unbearably silent. Her heart pounded against her ribs, each beat echoing louder in her ears. From the cracked mirror came a whisper so faint it almost blended with the air. The voice hissed, "Not yet." Megan's eyes widened, her lips parting in shock. The narrator observed her body trembling, the blanket slipping from her shoulders to the floor. She whispered, "No," though her voice carried no strength. The reflection leaned closer, its eyes alive with hunger. The narrator described how the room darkened suddenly, the lamp extinguishing without warning. In the silence, the whisper came again, softer but sharper, "Soon."